Terrific. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for participating today. We've got some exciting things to talk about with the social emotional learning, and so yeah, we shall go ahead and begin. Steve, did you want to add something as we begin, as I'm pulling forward and getting this going?
I think let's bring the slide deck up and we'll start right from the beginning.
Okay, great. And let me see, here we go. There we go. Great, thank you. Okay, so we've done the introduction. So again, thank you very much for participating today. And we'll go ahead and we'll jump straight in. So today, this is our agenda. Now, for those of you who signed up, hopefully you remember that this is a two-part session. So we have today for 1 hour, and then again next Thursday for an hour at the same time. And I think, is the Zoom link the same, Sachiko?
Yeah. No, the Zoom links would actually be different. There is registration required for the second session as well.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. So what we are going to be talking today about in today's session is we're going to discuss social emotional learning and how it connects to trauma and how the effects of trauma, what that has on the learning process. So at the end of today's session, we will ask that you will complete 2 surveys. One is an evaluation on this presentation that will help us learn from you. And the other is a self-reflection tool on your social emotional learning practices, which we will follow up on next week. So let's go ahead and move along.
Joe, I'm going to jump in real quick. So
sure.
Before we go on in the slides, I just want to give a little background. Johanna and I were asked by CalPro to put this together. We've spent a fair amount of time working on this, and I just kind of wanted to give you all of those folks, wonderful folks joining us in the virtual world. My virtual background here, there's another world behind that, behind the screen. This topic is near and dear to both of us. I have been working in adult ed for at least 10 years, but before that I worked in special ed, incarcerated adults, incarcerated youth, and I specialized early on in my career in what I refer to as wounded learners. So we come to this information, both of us, through a lot of experience. So I wanted to share that with you, just so you have a picture of why Johanna and I were brought together to create this presentation. We hope that 2 things. One, you'll walk away with some new information, but we also hope that it will give you an opportunity to reflect on not just the students that are in your classroom and how social emotional learning and trauma affects their learning processes, but how it affects you as a teacher, or a counselor, or an administrator. And I want to throw one quick little thought out there. If any of this triggers any emotional responses in you, please feel free to take the time to do some self-care, because when you talk about social emotional learning and trauma, sometimes it brings up our own trauma and our experiences. And that can be micro traumas to very big traumas. Most of us have already come out, are still trying to grapple with the COVID experience and the many things that came from that. So I just wanted to throw that out there just as a reminder to everybody. We want you to do self-care, practice self-care as well as you're learning about these new ideas. All right, Joe, you're on.
Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do first is just briefly cover what is social emotional learning. And of course, we're going to refer to it as SEL throughout the presentation, just to shortcut it. So as the screen says, it is an educational method that fosters social and emotional skills within the school curricula. So basically, it teaches skills to support healthy emotional development. The information is all research backed. So we have evidence that really shows that implementing SEL in the curriculum does lead to positive academic performance. So very quickly, we'll kind of go through briefly about what students acquire. So the information learned by having SEL as part of the curriculum, will help students acquire skills to develop healthy identities, such as manage emotions and understand how their emotions affect their behavior, feeling empathy and appreciate other people's feelings, or that they have feelings, Establish and maintain supportive relationships and how to work with diverse groups and individuals, make responsible, caring, and productive decisions, and achieve personal and collective goals and appreciate their role in making those goals happen.
And I want to speak to that real quickly. When we talk about social emotional learning, we're going to get further into this when we talk about the trauma-informed classroom. We want to set a picture for everybody. So the human being is a very complicated creation, as we all know. Millions of years went into the creation of each one of you. And we know now through neuroscience that the brain developed in stages of human development. So we have the initial part of the brain stem that developed. Those were our great ancestors, the dinosaurs, and beyond that. And we call that the lizard brain. That's where we go when we're traumatized. When we walk into an environment that socially we feel inept, we're incapable, we go to the lizard brain, self-defense. All learning stops. Then there's the middle brain, and then there's what we call the prefrontal cortex. Now, when we talk about achieving personal and collective goals, what we see with adults who are traumatized or who walk into a classroom that maybe they feel it's not a social environment for them to be working in, they can't access that prefrontal cortex and they go to the lizard brain. So I just wanted to set that out there. So when you see those students who are struggling with finding the ability to achieve those personal goals, finish their high school diploma, they work for their GED, you're probably looking at somebody who's got some levels of trauma in their learning process and in life. So I just wanted to put that on the table. It's sort of a little add to before we get into it deeper.
Thank you. Okay, so as we move along, I think it's fair to start with a little history on social emotional learning and how it has evolved in the past couple decades. And I want to bring this up because the ideas behind SEL probably sound familiar. And before, and I will say this because I know in trainings that I've seen, people go, oh yeah, I already know this. Oh yeah, I've heard this before. Or, you know, the risk of it, okay, another educational thing that they're going to put us through and drop later. And that is not correct. What has been happening is that we have become familiarized with some of these ideals because we've been part of the evolution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just very quickly, if we look at this way back in 50 years ago, in 1968, the whole child program with Dr. Comer, I think maybe some of you remember hearing about that. And then the next couple of years after that, we had more Yale educators, Dr. Weisberg and Mr. Schreiber, along with some educators in New Haven. They developed actually a framework for incorporating. So you can see how this is beginning to take off and evolve. And then fast forward to 1994, we have CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and the actual term social and emotional learning were put together. So today, actually at this time, there's only a few schools that are doing this. But today, CASEL is recognized in the US as the gold standard for implementing social and emotional learning into curriculum. And on the next slide, I'm just going to go over quickly a timeline for CASEL so we can see from 1994 to now and how research and laws became in there. So in the first 15 years or so, CASEL continued to promote, to do research, develop programs. In 2009, we see a federal act. Now, it's providing money to local area districts and states to start implementing it. Now, local curriculum is monitored by state and local responsibility. However, having federal backed money is helpful. It's going to really get it off the ground. Not too long after, in 2011, we see the act is amended so that we can include training for teachers and principals. Plus, we're seeing an 11% gain on those schools that are actually implementing it. And then the next one, and this was Mr. Obama when he was in there, this was another federal act that was passed. And this one is different because in the trainings that were part of the previous 2011 act, This now said, no, 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 these are not going to be one-off. We want this to be a continuum. This training continues on. So we really want to focus this, to develop it going through and forward. So now today, we actually have 27 steps or 27 states that have adopted K-12. And of course, California is one of them. We were one of the first. But all 50 states have actually adopted the pre-K implementation. So we know through research backed evidence that SEL does work, but we also know too that it benefits adults. And Steve just said something about this with educators. So educators with strong social and emotional competencies are reporting that they have higher level job satisfaction and less burnout, feel more effective at their jobs and less job-related anxiety. So it's working for all of us. And one last thing I want to say before we start moving on, through this evolution, what makes it different between then and now is the science. And Steve's going to speak to that. He did already just a moment ago. But in the last decade, research in the science of learning and development has actually made this link between social emotional learning and positive outcomes backed up by science. So what we knew, because we saw it, is now backed up by actual scientific information.
And I want to go back just a second, Joe. So we start here at 1994 with Kessel, but even before that, Dr. James Comer was foundational in starting this process. What he realized is he was working with students that were coming from very low and poverty struck communities, and he was looking at their learning and their scores. And he realized that if you're going to address the child's needs, you have to address not just the child, but the whole family. That's how they came up with the whole child. So he was groundbreaking in bringing about the foundation that understood that traumatized students cannot learn. Now, that was back in 1968. So this was groundbreaking. Now what we have is we have an evolution of seeing the value in this. We're seeing student scores go up. But what we've understood through all of this, which has really been brought forth, which I'm going to talk about further on, is the neurology behind this and the brain science behind this. And that is rather new. That's in the last 10 years. We've really begun to understand.
Okay, and let's talk about that.
So the effects of trauma. Now, this program is about social emotional learning, but you can't pull trauma-informed learning away from social emotional learning. Just creating a social emotionally effective classroom has to also be reflective of understanding that there is trauma involved in many cases with many students that are coming into our classrooms. We're going to talk about a couple of things, and one we're going to drill down on is called the ACEs study. And the reason that's so important is it was groundbreaking, and we'll talk about it. We'll show you the evidence. But it was groundbreaking in understanding how in childhood, things that affect children turn around and affect adults in so many ways, not just learning, but disease. So back in 1995 to 1997, Kaiser Permanente, along with the CDC, the Centers for Disease, did a really simple thing. They put together a survey. And in this survey, it asks some very key questions. And what they were able to do with this information from the survey is they were able to track over a 10-year period folks who showed high levels of trauma, what they called ACEs scores, and how it affected their physical, their mental, and their lifelong outcomes. If you have a certain number of ACEs, trauma issues that you've dealt with through childhood, you're more than likely to be imprisoned. You're more than likely to be drug or alcohol related issues, smoking, and the list goes on. Joe, if you could connect to that link that's right down below.
Oh, sorry. You want to go over here?
Yeah, if you could open that up.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want more information on this website will give you, and I'll have Joe scroll down in just a minute, but this website will give you the history of the ACEs study. And if you scroll down, this right here will show you the questions. You can click on those and it'll show you the questions that's a part of the ACEs study. Those are free. You can use parts of them, but it'll give you a picture of where your students are at. It gives you data and statistics, and then it gives you the major findings. So it's filled with information that if you want to dig a little bit deeper, I highly suggest you take a look at this website. It's the CDC website, and this information will all be shared with you. All right, if we can go back to the slideshow.
Okay.
Perfect.
Move on to the next.
Next slide. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to share with you a video by Dr. Nadine Burke. Dr. Nadine Burke was one of the first out of Oakland, out of San Francisco, Hunters Bayview, who began realizing that the struggles they were seeing with health issues in a very traumatized region of San Francisco had to do with physical trauma that had taken place. And she's going to tie the ACEs study to what she found. We're going to just watch roughly 10 minutes of this video. We'll pause at the end for any questions. And then this video will be available. It's actually a 16-minute video, but we're going to watch the first 10 minutes of it. All right.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California, and together we opened a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, "Dr. Burke, have you seen this?" In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career.
Or you can cut it
The
there.
Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
Johanna, if you want to bring us back up.
I will. Thank you. Okay, we ready to move on to the results here?
Go on to the next one.
Okay.
So before we read off these results, which you can read to yourselves, I want to go back to all the way back to 1964, when Dr. Comer began the process of building what we now refer to as social emotional learning. And he said, and I quote, "Teachers are not trained and prepared to deal with the social emotional issues that they're being faced with." And I repeat, teachers are not trained and prepared to deal with the social emotional issues. This was in 1964. And here we are in 2023. And those issues haven't gotten less. They've exponentially grown. So this is not a story of defeat, but this is a story of hope. There's hope. By developing the skills that we hope you'll begin to look into and take away from this training, you'll begin to see your students in your classroom in a different light and who's coming to you and what they're struggling with. So when you look at the results here, this pyramid is looking at trauma that takes place starting in childhood in many cases, but it can happen in adulthood too. It can happen at any time. We've all got stories, traumatic stories. Some of us have those support systems in place that help build the resilience to overcome the trauma. But there are many that don't. So what happens is when we look at this pyramid, there's generational embodiment. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about epigenetic trauma, historical trauma. We're going to share some information with you to look at that. Then there's the social conditions, the local context, where they live, where are they from? And this could be out in the country. This could be in the center of the city. This could be anywhere. Then we're going to look at where these adverse childhood experiences take place, how they affect neurodevelopment, or what we call disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the ability to have empathy for others, the list goes on. The adoption of health risk behavior, disease, disability, and social problems, and at the top of the pyramid, the effects of trauma and not having the supports in place, early death. Now, you can make a difference just by recognizing that someone's struggling. By doing that very thing, you change their trauma. You can't fix everything, you're a teacher, but you can begin to build, and we're going to share in our section 2 of this slideshow next week, we're going to share some of the things that are available to you that you can connect with to help those students that you see that are struggling. So there's a direct link between childhood trauma and later life negative outcomes. And the more ACEs, the more of these traumatic events, the greater the incidence of negative outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joe, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm good. I'm ready to talk a little bit about stress.
Please.
Okay. So stress, as we know, affects the body. We have good stress and we have bad stress. It's an emotion. It's how we react when we feel under pressure or if we are feeling threatened. A little bit of stress is good for people. There's good stress, there's bad stress, but too much can be overwhelming. So if we take a look at this diagram, you have on the upper level is kind of what is looking at good stress, and the bottom is bad stress. So if we take a look at the top, and by the way, those red lightning bolts, those are stress. Those are representing stress. So on the top line, the good stress shows that shortly before and after receiving information in the short term, you see this person resting and they're getting up the next day and they have it. It's because they're able to retain it and the information is sticking with them. So good stress is the response It will temporarily increase our energy and focus, but that really is dependent on what it is. If it's something that is actually doable, okay, we know we can do it, and we also know that it's temporary. So that's the good stress. But the bottom line, where we're showing kind of the bad stress, it actually impairs memory. So think of somebody who is in a constant state of stress. They're in a constant state of stress or continuum stress, and they're not here in the here and now, so they can't focus, accurately as if somebody's experiencing the short-term stress. So if that makes sense, because they're preoccupied, they can't get their, well, if we dare say, the brain in the game. But more than that, this is actually chemical, and we'll talk a little bit more on that. And Steve, do you want to add some things here?
Absolutely.
I know you love chemical.
So there has been so much research on how the brain learns. And what Jill brings up, and this graphic that she found is wonderful. The brain takes in information. That's what we call the encoding part of the brain. It brings in that information, that data. And if there's any stress that hits them at that encoding, then there's no consolidation. And when we say encoding, what we're talking about literally is making pictures. We build pictures in the brain, and those pictures are stored. And then they become consolidated so that they make sense. And then if everything's functioning, we're in a good state, we have our needs met, Maslow's theory of needs, we're able to take that information and decode it. We call it retrieval. And as time goes on, we update that information. So that's why you'll find those students in your high school diploma program or your English language program or your GED program, where they weren't able to encode the information properly. They weren't able to consolidate it. And so when they go to try and retrieve it and update it, they have gaps. They could have gaps in understanding fractions, decimals, percents, vowel sounds, you name it. And the trauma and the stress put those gaps into their learning process. It's like a hard drive that's been scratched or something's happened to it. So that picture is so important to understand about how stress, and if we can create as best we can a stress-free environment for our students, then they can begin the process of retrusting that they can learn. They can encode the information. Then we can find out where it is that they have the gaps in that consolidation and retrieval. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so a little bit more on the body's reaction to stress. So the brain is a cultural organ. We understand that experience helps shape the brain. And going back to what Dr. Comer was saying, the whole child, and what Stephen was referring to, we really do learn from how we are, the self-care, on how we are treated, how we are cared for. So, I mean, I think we all pretty much know that. But again, the trauma, if we are experiencing that, it's actually going to change the brain chemistry. So one of the things that happens after trauma is the threat perception system. So when trauma changes this area, it can turn into a fear-driven brain. So what that basically is kind of like muscle memory. Okay, so a person with a fear-driven brain isn't connecting to the present because their thinking is effectively hijacked because they're in the constant state of worrying about what is going to happen or what's not going to happen, and they're so occupied by the flight, fight, freeze mode that their nervous system cuts off their thinking part of the brain. They just can't pull the information in. Stephen, do you want to move along, or should we?
I want to stop for a minute because Delfino Murillo, I think I got that right. I hope I got that right. Delfino asked a great question. Are there tips to creating stress-free environments for students, or would that be more site-specific? Not to not answer the question, but if you stick around for the second of these trainings next week, Delfino, we're going to give you all kinds of tools for adapting to your students and your environment, creating a stress-free environment. One thing I can tell you is that one of the keys we know, one of the key takeaways we know from every level of study is, and this is a quick question for you to ask yourself, and you're going to ask yourself in a survey we're going to have you do, but to ask yourself, is your classroom, to the best of your ability, is it a warm and inviting environment? Because if that sense of trust is built right from the very get-go, like this is a place where I can learn, then you're already beginning to take the edge off of some of that stress that our learners come into the classroom with. So thank you for the question. And please, others, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Joe and I want this to be interactive. We have a time constraint, but as much as it can be, we will definitely try to answer your questions.
Yeah, I think we might be doing pretty good on time here. So let's talk about trauma. Continue on, informing the body. There we go.
All right. So if you have not seen this book by Bessel van der Kolk, he actually has a website as well. So that's what the link on the bottom here is. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, psychiatrist, had been working with PTSD from war veterans, you name it, drug addiction, everything under the sun. And in this book, what he brings to bear is how the body, literally as the title says, keeps the trauma. We never escape the parameters of the trauma that affects us. We learn to adapt and grow beyond the trauma. So I don't want anybody to think that you're going to walk away with a magic wand and erase people's trauma. That's not going to happen. But what you do is you work with them and help them build the skill sets to live with their trauma. And it's not just teachers and counselors, it's psychologists. There's a whole team that needs to be here. But I can tell you this, if a student is successful in school and they feel like they're in an environment that is inviting and helpful, then what happens in the brain is they get what we call natural drug high. Endorphins and serotonin levels go up. Success builds endorphin and serotonin levels. When I have enough of that, I can build the resilience to deal with the good stress that is what helps learning. When I don't have that, I go right to the fight or flight, back to the lizard brain, and I look to protect myself. So Dr. van der Kolk, and somebody's already put it in the chat, Patricia, a great book. You are absolutely right. Thank you for giving us a thumbs up on that. If you have not read this book, I would say, please do read this book. And there are others. I mean, the research in the back of the book alone is worth the effort looking at the book. But what he talks about is we carry our trauma in our bodies, and literally it keeps the score on whether or not we're able to move on in life. You see people, I just came across a homeless man the other day in San Francisco. And, mental illness is one of those that stymies all of us, especially when we see it in a homeless person. It throws fear into all of us. And he was walking along and he was bent over, really bent over, hunched over. And for some reason, it just struck me to just acknowledge him as a human being. I couldn't change his life situation, but I just acknowledged it. I looked at him and he looked me in the eye and I said, hello. And he got the warmest smile and he said, hello. And this is what was telling. His body didn't completely straighten up, but it began to straighten up. The body keeps the score. That little experience, he began to straighten up because somebody acknowledged him. He felt like a human being. And I felt like a human being. He did me a favor because I walked away going, oh, wow, is it that simple? And the answer is yes and no. So, Joe, anything you want to throw in on Dr. van der Kolk's book?
Yeah, and I think we had a couple that remarked about this, but I do want to say it's such a good read. It's easy to read. Most of these books you kind of open up and go, oh no, because it's so scientific and all that. He writes beautifully. It's really a nice read. So and yeah, you learn a lot about trauma and how it really is. And again, it's kind of that stuff that maybe you already know or have a sense of, but here it is. We've got the science.
And Delfino put in the chat that there is a free PDF version of this book. If you go to Dr. van der Kolk's website, there's a lot of free training that's there. And then there's another book in here by Davis Mejia. Does this work parallel Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine? I can't answer that question, Davis. I'm sorry. Sounds like an interesting book, but thank you for putting that in there. And Delfino did share the link. So yes, and Patricia put, just be in a safe place. If you have trauma, it can trigger it. Thank you for bringing that up, Patricia. That is exactly right. If you have trauma, if you're going into this work, and most of us stay away from trauma, that's why we stay away from mental illness. because almost all of us have it somewhere in our family line. And when we see it in another person, it can trigger it in us. So we have to think about that as educators, counselors, administrators, that this can also affect us and trigger things in us. So thank you for bringing that up.
I'm going to go ahead and move along. We're keeping in with PTSD. So talking about triggers, symptoms are going to include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, uncontrollable thoughts about an event. So unless the trauma goes untreated, and again, as Stephen just said, is that ever going to go away? But they can learn to manage it. It's going to remain, whether consciously or subconsciously, in their everyday life. Triggers are what you're going to see when that comes out. Is something triggered it, taking them back to that event. It may not have been exactly the same thing, but something very similar that took them a smell, something that will bring them back to that particular event or that sense. And then the body will, again, take over control, and you're right in there. So as it says, being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on. Okay, contaminated by the past. So I'm going to move along to the next one while we're still talking about PTSD. So Stephen, I believe this is your slide.
Yes. So this is going back to the neurology that we understand. And that lizard brain is there because in the early phases of life on the planet, it was a eat or be eaten environment. So humans are programmed for survival, and that can look like many things. For some humans, survival is not a stressful thing. Their needs are met. But we are programmed. It's in our very DNA. It's in our very brainstem. It's in our very existence. That's why we're alert when we sense any kind of issue that might be happening in our life. We become alert right away. So we're programmed for survival. We have a fight or flight instinct. That's that lizard brain. When we aren't able to escape the danger, the brain literally shuts down because it's protecting us. It's sort of like if you were to get hypothermia, the body will shut down to protect the heart and the brain. It's programmed to do that. Well, it's the same thing with trauma. Trauma shuts down all reactions so that you are able to continue, because the trauma itself, by itself, if it's great enough, could kill you just by the shock of it. So, and I'm not trying to over bloat this. I just want the picture to be there that a lot of our students that walk into our classrooms are carrying these loads already when they walk into our classrooms. So when we talk about creating a social emotional learning environment, we need to inform ourselves of what we're seeing. No human being was born to fail. And anybody can contradict me, but in my 37 years of teaching, I have never seen a human being that was born to fail. Something happened. Something happened. We're not going to solve the whole riddle, but we might be that face that says, you count. Thank you for showing up. How can I help you? Trauma is when you feel powerless to stop what is happening to you. So we as teachers, educators, and counselors are some of the most powerful people on the planet because we can re-empower somebody. We can say, thank you for showing up to my class. Now I want to help you learn. You don't have to go into all the endorphins and the serotonin levels, but in your mind, you're going, I'm going to help you build those endorphins and serotonin levels and build resilience. And if I can, I'm going to connect you to providers who can go a little bit deeper in providing the care you need to get on the road to wherever you're trying to get to. Because as teachers, we get serotonin and dopamine levels in the brain when our students succeed. How exciting.
Told you he liked chemistry. There you go. More chemistry.
So trauma, defined, it goes beyond the event, leaves an imprint on the mind, the brain, and the body. Body keeps the score, has ongoing consequences for the victim's survival. I think that's pretty clear. We've talked about it. We just wanted to make sure that we can bring this in from every angle. And if you have questions, now's a good time to either open up a mic or jump in on the chat. I think we're doing okay for time, Joe.
Yeah, we are. I thought we were running a little bit slow, but we're good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you do have any questions or thoughts, and Alicia said thank you. She just downloaded the book. Nice. Oh, I love it when that happens.
Yeah.
I just got an endorphin drop right there. Boom. Look at that. Thank you for that, Alicia. All right.
Ready to go? We have another book for you.
Yes. So in studying neurologically, studying the effects of trauma, what became understood, and this isn't new. I want to say that this understanding goes all the way back beyond the Old Testament. It talks about the Old Testament, and they use the word sins, but I'm going to call it the trauma. The trauma of the fathers shall be visited upon the children for 7 generations. Well, this is what we call epigenetic trauma. My wife is a neonate intensive care nurse, and they've done studies on a baby who's born to a drug addicted or a mother who's heavily traumatized, and how that trauma in vitro in the womb is transferred to the child and shapes the very DNA of the child, how their brain develops, how their lungs develop. This goes back generations. The question becomes, how do we help people break the cycle of this epigenetic trauma? This book by Mark Wolin, who's the founder and director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco, talks about it didn't start with you. We all have this feeling like I'm a failure. Why am I a failure? Why do I struggle with this? Why do I struggle with mental illness? Why do I struggle with drug addiction? Why do I struggle with math? Well, it goes back generations. And if you sit and think about it, everybody has those stories about aunt so-and-so or uncle so-and-so that was never unpacked. So epigenetic trauma is inherited family trauma that then shapes the very DNA and moves through family lines. And you as educators and counselors, teachers, administrators are in the front line of helping people break this cycle of epigenetic trauma.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and move along. Well, now what we're going to do is start bringing this back into the classroom. And so what we have here is PTSD, and according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, repeated exposure to traumatic events, especially during a child's early years, can adversely affect their attention, memory, and cognition, reduce the ability to focus, organize, and process information, interfere with effective problem solving and planning, result in overwhelming feelings and frustration. And that last one, I particularly think of our students, our adult students, and thinking about how maybe, how they disappear on us. And might this be a response to those feelings of frustration and anxiety? I know Steve and I were talking about things that had happened when we were kids in school. And yes, they were not earth-shattering traumas, but when you're at a certain age, they are. And I remember a teacher, I was in high school, chastised me for something in front of the class, my first day. And it was my last day. I never went back to that class. So you think about how that affected my learning on that. So, and I'm sure we all have stories. Anybody here remember a story of how a teacher hurt your feelings and how it affected really when you think about it, and maybe even now as an adult, how you still, feel that? Yep, Julie Cross. Yes, you do. Got a story for us?
I'll never forget my first day of kindergarten that I was so excited because my parents taught me how to spell my whole name, including Miss, M-I-S-S. They thought it was really cute for me to have a little title, I guess. And the kindergarten teacher, I was so excited that I shouted it out in the class when she was asking us if we could spell our names. And she just gave me the worst look in the world. And all the other students looked at me, and I just never forget how embarrassed I was.
Julie, you just illustrated Basil van der Kolk's thesis. The body keeps the score. It's always there. Adrian Amsbury teacher wrote my name on the board in second grade because I spoke without raising my hand, and I was mortified. And, these are what we call micro traumas, and they add up.
Sorry.
Aaron, we've got Aaron has raised his hand. Aaron, did you want to share?
I'm a she, her person. Thank you for this information. I just wanted to share that I worked for a number of years running a learning center for active duty sailors who are adult learners. And it was a combination of adult basic ed and shoring up to start college level courses or maybe test out of college level courses. So it was a wide variety. But I can't even begin to tell you how many stories I heard of why someone was there who never learned fractions, or who didn't know how to write an essay, or who was missing very important education skills for their goals at this point in their life. And then they would tell me the stories of what had happened in school. And here they were as adults coming to work on these things despite these barriers that had kept them from doing this before. So it's a very real phenomenon, and it takes many, many forms. So yes, I agree that everyone probably has their stories, and our society is full of people that have their stories. So I mean, and people choose paths other than the ones they would prefer to, based on some of the effects of this. So thank you for this topic, and thanks for letting me share.
Aaron, thank you, and thank you for letting me know that I had the wrong name, Aaron. So thank you for that. You're absolutely spot on. Everything you said is spot on. How many lives have been changed because of the trauma, and how many can we help get back on track to where they might be trying to go? I run 3 jail programs. I've worked in juvenile hall. I've worked with level 14 emotionally disturbed students. And it never ceases to amaze me the amount of human resilience and how one act of kindness can change so much. So thank you for that, for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right, Joanna.
Okay. Julie raised her hand. Julie, we'll get to you in 1 second. I just want to finish up with this. The academic consequences to further this is going to be very clearly students that have fundamentally low reading abilities, lower students' academic performance, or students' lower performance, more school absences, like I just told you, I ditched that class forever, result in more suspensions and expulsions, and of course, increase the possibility of dropping out. So you can see it's a direct link to, even if the traumas that, as we know as adults, are slight, they're huge in the moment and they still affect us. Julie, you had a question, you had your hand raised?
It's more of a comment. I just wanted to comment, it's funny how we take our ACEs for granted, but coming into kindergarten, I had a lot of those: substance abuse, mentally ill parent. Later, my parents were divorced, like the whole thing. So school was, for me, always a safe space where I could find acceptance and get a lot of positive reinforcement. So
Nice.
It's really interesting. I think that teacher, when I think about it, sort of shooting me down that first day was really a lot bigger than I thought. It's interesting. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's horrible when you think about some of the things that have been said to children. And just want to make sure that we're certainly more aware of that now.
Well, and I want to address, Lana's got a message in here. Lana Prince, yes, is one of the first people who meets new students returning to school. I feel like a large part of the work is simply helping people to feel safe, comfortable, and welcome. And I want to say yes, yes, yes. And I want to add, and it's taking it to the next step and building the classroom where they are actually getting the teaching that helps them build the skills to get back on that path. A statistic from the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, COAB, in 2018, and this is a stark statistic, but basically stated that 80%, this was back in 2018, I wonder what it is today, that 80% of adult students who went through a GED high school diploma completion program did nothing with it. They didn't change their job, their lives, because the trauma, they don't know what the next steps are. So we as educators become their prosthetic executive function to help them build those skill sets to get on. So the first part is, you're absolutely spot on. It's creating that safe environment. And then it's creating that safe and challenging environment that helps them see the path to those next level of skills. And we're going to talk about that in the next presentation as well. And we've got some more messages in here.
I'm not really looking at the chat here.
It looks like Lisa Doonan has a hand up. I'm looking at time. I think we can go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, yes, I was just going to say that it's, especially if anyone has had PTSD or is, like, I heard people saying they were had a difficult upbringing, how you go on the other side, you know, you go to the extreme. Because yeah, I mean, it makes you, yeah, there was some stuff that happened to me and it was like, whoa, I'm going way on that other side. And like you're saying, be kind to smile to someone who may not look well groomed. That does brighten their day. You know, I'm an avid walker. I do that all the time, you know, and do I feel safe? I just make sure I know I can run faster. So
Well said. Well said. Protecting
all right.
yourself while you're protecting others. Well said. All right, Joe.
Okay, so we are going to tighten up. There we go. Tighten it up. Okay, so just want to get back to today. We explored effects of trauma on learning, and we're going to pick up from here in our next session, and we will continue to discuss SEL. We're also going to get into, and this is Stephen, neuroscience, and also we want to talk about how to implement this now. Okay, so we're working on this. K-12 is working on it. They have a lot of support, but we're not. Some of those translate, and not all of them do. So how do we get this implemented into our classrooms and into our counseling offices, particularly because that's where my background is, and it's hard to get it going when it's so fast paced and everything is going on. But we want to we're going to share our experiences, and we hope to have you share your experience, because this is a learning opportunity for all of us. And then also we're going to look at some tools that Stephen said, you know, for creating an SEL environment in the counseling office and also in the classroom. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a survey for you. Actually, it's kind of two. One is going to be an evaluation, talk about this presentation, because we really are looking to learn from you what went well, and where we could maybe add to. And then after that, it will direct you to a self-reflection, social-emotional self-reflection survey for you to go in there and put your information in and see where your strengths areas are and where maybe you have some areas that you can improve on. And then we'll also ask for people to share out next week on that. And Preguntas?
So it looks like, thank you, Delfino, for putting the PDF for The Body Keeps the Score. By the way, we get no kickback from Basil. We just like the work he's done, and there's more work you can look at. But the PDF is in there. Please do fill out the survey. That will then give you the survey for you to, as Johanna said, look at your classroom. And that's part of those tools, is a self-reflection on how am I doing in my classroom and working with my students. And that covers so many issues. We want to give you those practical skills. And next week, we're going to give you some really practical tools along with carrying this conversation on a little bit further.
Yeah. Okay, so Miss Laura put the bit.ly link in, and we have here a code. But one thing I want to mention to you, if you have time to do this now, otherwise, if you can just write down the bit.ly and go to it later, because the self-reflection tool is going to take you a good 15 minutes to go through and do. So it's important that you have the time to do it. So if you've got the time now, great, go for it. But if you don't, please think about doing it later, but please don't forget to do it later.
Yeah, and I just want to address real quickly in the chat, Gabriella Stiles wrote, also aware of complex PTSD, DSD, and intersectionality in relation to generational traumas in our BIPOC, BIPOC students and communities. Absolutely. That's that that's a huge topic to cover right there on its own. So thank you for putting that in there, Gabriella.
Yeah. Great.
Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Like Joe said, we have another session next week, same time. Please register for it if you haven't already. And this bit.ly link will take you first to the evaluation link for today's webinar. That will take only a couple minutes. And then after that, you'll be redirected to your homework per se, to do your self-reflection. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Joe and Stephen, for wonderful facilitation.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
I see you, hopefully see many of you next week.
Yeah.